Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jobs Report podcast brought to you by Swob, where today we're going to be discussing the most recent July 2024 jobs report that was released last Friday and break down some of the information that was released and talk about the report that came out and what all of that information means. So, right off the bat, first thing, Steph, unemployment rate increased from 4.1% to 4.3%. So a lot of anxiety with the market right now. And just what do you think that means? What are your thoughts when you see something like that?
Well, obviously, the unemployment rate increasing is not the best news. But what we've seen too is that about 440,000 people have been surveyed and mentioned that due to the weather and hurricanes, they actually were unable to go to work in the month of July. Of course, obviously, the unemployment rate rising is not the best news. But there are things that are out of our control that have added to this. So when 440,000 people are saying that weather
is a big chunk. It's a big chunk of people.
It is a big chunk. I think 250,000 people were on temporary layoff last month. So temporary layoff as well definitely adds to that number. And that's a big chunk of Americans that either couldn't get to work because of the weather and the hurricane, which we get. That's out of all of our control.
For sure, that's a good point.
Temporary layoff too, I think, adds to it. It's not the best news, but people also need to focus and see other opportunities as to why it's adding to the unemployment rate.
No, I think that's a good point that you mentioned. I don't think a lot of people are going to think about the fact that there's other factors that could have played into why there was an increase in unemployment. And if they're surveying something like 400,000 people, well, that's a big chunk of people who are working ideally, or you'd think that they're working. And if they're unable to go to work, well, that's a large group of people in the economy that if they're missing out on time and they're not showing up to work, well, then obviously that's going to impact this. And I don't think that's something that you're seeing in a lot of these reports that have been released. And I think beyond the information that was released, I think that's a really good point, because if you're living in a state where there is weather issues or things like that, or it's those states where you might have to worry about certain hurricane seasons or whatever it is.
Exactly, and that's what it was the last month, was because of the hurricane that just hit. And obviously, there's a hurricane, nobody's working. So I agree. I think it's something that we also need to look into, is the fact that this does add to the unemployment rate.
So are you saying that you're a little bit more optimistic than a lot of these people who are analyzing the most recent report? Because I know there's a lot of angst right now. A lot of people are really anxious and have anxiety about fears of a recession and the economy continuing to fall. But are you thinking that bounce back up? Are you kind of cautiously optimistic right now? Like, what are you thinking when you read stuff like this?
I'm staying cautiously optimistic. I want to see how next month's job report is affected by this and kind of go from there, because obviously weather does play a large factor here.
I wonder if time of year too has any sort of impact. I wonder if people are traveling more, or just more and more people are taking time off because it's July.
100%.
These are all things that are going to impact that. And I wonder, if you look at past months where unemployment dropped, does the fact that this is a summer month have anything to do with that? I'm not too sure, but I think there's a lot of negativity around the most recent report. But I think there is reason to be optimistic, and I think even if you look at some of the job gains that happened in the month, I know that the average was 215,000, and there was only 114,000 new jobs added. When you think about 114,000 and 215,000, well, that's a huge gap. But there are certain sectors that did really, really well in the month of July. A sector like healthcare, who added 55,000 jobs, which is a significant increase in areas like home healthcare and hospital service, and that's really good. I don't think that there's any negative there. If the healthcare industry is getting more people and it's already so strapped as it is, that's a good thing. That's a positive, in my opinion, and I'm sure somebody will look at that and see the increase in jobs in a sector like healthcare and might think, well, there should have been more, and maybe there should. I'm not too sure. But I think the fact that sector or that industry was growing is a good thing.
Yeah, and even I believe construction as well. Construction industry added about 25,000 new jobs as well, which is also great, and it is continuing to grow, the construction industry. So there are, like you said, even though know this might be a little bit of a negative job.
It is a negative report. In the grand scheme of things, the information that was released wasn't good. But I think even with construction as an example, 25,000 new jobs added in construction. Well, for the people who have angst and fears over a recession, if construction is growing and there's more people working in that industry and more infrastructure is being built, well, that's just going to help the economy. So that's a good thing in my opinion. So even though there's a lot of negatives in this report, I think the fact that sectors like healthcare and construction have grown, there's little nuggets of positivity in there, and I think those are all good things.
And even transportation and warehousing as well added roughly about 14,000 new jobs, which is great too. So looking at this as a way to kind of grow and a way to learn, okay, if you are looking for a job right now, maybe it is time to focus on a few of the industries that do continue to add jobs and do continue to grow and will continue to grow throughout the years. So even if you are thinking right now of possibly changing your careers, maybe healthcare, because baby boomers, we know that they're getting older and they are going to need in-home healthcare for sure. Different services, hospitals will always need people. So maybe it's time to even look at, if you are thinking of changing your careers, maybe taking a look at the healthcare, construction, transportation, and warehouse industry. And maybe there is something there for you that you can explore a little bit further to kind of know like these are growing industries. Like I said, especially healthcare and with the baby boomers getting older, that is going to be a growing industry. So that's something that you can look into and see what are the jobs within the healthcare sector that could fit your needs.
Well, especially I even look at with transportation and warehousing, like you mentioned, Steph, they added 14,000 jobs. Well, I think that's great. One thing that stands out for me there is if you're doing general labor or working in a warehouse, and whether it's stocking or whatever it is, typically these are unskilled jobs. These are jobs that you can go into with minimal experience, and so it's something, like you said, if you're looking for a new job or kind of a shift in a job, or just do something different, that could be an industry that might be appealing to a lot of people because it's growing, which is obviously a good thing, but there's going to be more opportunities there. So it's something that a lot of people who maybe didn't think about before maybe can make that shift and try something new. So I think those are things that if we're going to try and pinpoint any sort of positives that came out in the last month, these are things that, sure, in the grand scheme of things, like I said, it wasn't a great release, but these are things that if you want to try and pinpoint certain positives that came out of it, these are things that I think you can look to for, I guess, reasons to be cautiously optimistic.
Exactly. And learn too and see, like you said, what industries are growing, so that maybe it's this industry that you might want to grow in yourself. So another thing too is work hours. So the average work week for all employees actually decreased a bit, roughly about 34 hours per week. Even just like the holidays, summer months, that this could possibly affect that?
I'm not too sure, to be honest with you, but one thing with that, I was a little surprised that the average work week actually decreased considering the unemployment went up. So my thought when I saw that is if less people are working, then the current people who are working, in my opinion, I would have thought that they would have been working more hours. So I was a little bit surprised to see that the number of working hours a week dropped. I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure if it's maybe because majority of these jobs that were added are maybe unskilled or part-time, but whatever the reason, I was a little surprised to see that because, again, like I said, I would have thought that if there's less people working, well, then the people that are currently in the workforce would have been working more to make up for the fact that less people are working. So I was a little bit surprised to see that, if I'm being honest with you, Steph.
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay. I think with the latest jobs report, it's pretty interesting. This is something that I'm really excited to see how August turns out, because I really do feel that the weather, it definitely does play a role on how people and how the economy is affected. And like I said, it is something that is out of our hands. Pretty interested to see what the next job report brings for us.
Yeah, no, me too. And it's funny you said that because I'm especially kind of excited to see what September's job report brings when everyone's back at school and summer's kind of winding down. And obviously September, it's not as fun of a month as July or August. People are going back to school, going back to work, whatever it might be. So more reality sort of sets in versus that summer months where you can vacation and have a good time. And that's not to say you can't have a good time in those months either, but it's not as fun as obviously the summer months. So I'm curious to see, even in those jobs reports coming out in the next few months, I'm curious to see how things kind of shift, because obviously I think the bar was set pretty low with July's report. So any sort of increases, obviously not increases in unemployment, but if things increase in the right areas,
yes,
I'm curious to see what that means and how that affects people's habits. And obviously right now, like we talked about, obviously there's a lot of anxiety amongst people, and a lot of people don't want to spend right now. There's not a ton of spending. And so I'm just curious, as the economy maybe rebounds a little bit, is that going to give more and more people confidence again and go out and spend a little bit more? I'm not too sure. So I think it's something where time will tell. We'll wait and see what happens. But I think the consensus and the overall when looking at July's report is it wasn't great. There was a lot of things that you could point out as being negatives, but there were slight positives there. And I wonder, even things like U.S. election, all of that coming up soon, that'll be here before you know it. And that's going to play a huge role in the jobs reports and what kind of happens in the U.S. economy. It'll be fascinating to see how it all unfolds, especially as election time get closer to October, November, and the election actually happens. I'm very curious to see what happens then, because that'll really give us the signs of where the consumer's mind is at, how confident they are. But for right now, I know that there's a lot of reason to be pessimistic when looking at this, but I think there are little tiny nuggets for reasons to be optimistic. So we'll see what happens.
We will see what happens. And I think on that note, some of the areas that if you are looking for a job, like we mentioned, the sectors that are hiring and growing throughout the summer months that we've recently seen have been in healthcare, construction, transportation, and warehouse. So if you are looking, these are industries that are growing and will continue to grow.
Hopefully.
I just want to say, yeah, definitely, hopefully. Looking forward to seeing what next month brings us. And we thank you for listening to the Jobs Report podcast today by Swob.
Until the next one.